Level up your LA Kings experience with the new Vivid Seats Elite Seats. All the on-ice Kings action with even more exclusive access. Enjoy great seats to the game along with premier dining inside the Lexus Club with all-you-can-eat food and non-alcoholic beverages. Plus, get a free Team LA Kings item and parking with your purchase. Score your Vivid Seats Elite Seats tickets today and earn rewards on each purchase from the only ticket company that rewards you for buying. Experience it live with Vivid Seats, the official partner of the LA Kings.
You're listening to an LA Kings podcast. For more episodes of this and every other Kings program, visit lakings.com/podcast.
You're listening to All the Kings Men, the official podcast of the LA Kings. Now, here's your host, Jesse Cohen.
All right, joining me now to talk about the NHL, the LA Kings, and the upcoming playoffs, Neil Smith, former general manager of the 1994 Stanley Cup winning New York Rangers team, and also the only man in history to be the general manager of both the Rangers and the Islanders. How are you doing today, Neil?
I'm doing well, thanks, Jesse. Nice to be here.
It's not obviously the exact same thing in LA because we only have one team here, but every now and then you'll have a guy like Todd McClellan who coached the Sharks and the Kings, and, or somebody, a player who played for the Ducks and the Kings, and you always want to just sort of notice that odd, cross-market or cross-state rivalry in their career.
Yeah, it is something. I think that the rivalry of the Islanders and the Rangers is one of the fiercest ones I've ever seen, and it goes right back to when I first saw it. And I know that the Ducks and the Kings has come up since they played each other in the playoffs once. Correct? Didn't they play one series? And that's what really does make it a rivalry, is when you play in the playoffs, because that's
Agreed.
A whole different kettle of fish. But Calgary Edmonton is quite a rivalry, but they've played each other in the playoffs, and there's but that's what makes this game so great, is all the different rivalries.
So then let me jump in with my first question, and I wasn't planning on asking this, but I feel like it came up, and it's one of those ones where you don't know me, Neil, so you won't know that I have strong opinions about a lot of different topics, and it's sort of what I'm known for. But this is one of those subjects where I don't have a strong opinion, but my lack of strong opinion makes me have a strong opinion about other people's strong opinions. The playoff format, it's currently a divisional format, 1 versus wild card, 2 versus 3. It's been that way since, I want to say, 2013-14. Prior to that, it was the 1 through 8, where there were 3 divisions in each conference, and the division winners got the first 3 seeds in the playoffs, and then after that, it was, your record in the conference. I prefer the divisional format that we currently have, but if it changed, I wouldn't really care. You still have to play good teams. You still have to win 4 rounds, all the rhetoric that we all know. But there are a number of fans, and I've discovered they're particularly younger fans, who want to go back to a conference ranking matchup, and they say they're bored with divisional playoffs because it's the same 2 teams playing each other, especially in the case of the Kings playing Edmonton 4 years in a row. Do you have a preference from a competitive standpoint or based on your experience in the game?
I'm a purist. I go back to the original 6. So if I was doing it, it would be 1 versus 8, 2 versus 7, 3 versus 5
in the conference.
3 versus 6. Yes, in the conference. Okay. And then I would have them reseed again, which they're not doing now anymore. They were doing that. Because what I think is that you've got to make the regular season as meaningful as possible. And if you're going to say, okay, out of Winnipeg, Dallas, and Colorado, one of them's going to be gone after the first round. I mean, it just seems unfair. And it also seems unfair that, out of Vegas, LA, and Edmonton, somebody's going to be gone after the first round. They put in this 6-month journey to get to that spot, and now it's going to be over in 10 days to 2 weeks.
Would you, I don't know how closely you follow the NBA, but they have this play-in tournament where I think the top 10 teams technically have some form of postseason play. The 7, 8, 9, 10 seeds play each other to determine who's going to be the 7th and 8th seed. Would you, because one of my thoughts is now we have 32 teams. I've heard rumblings that the league might expand to 34, 35, 36. It seems crazy to me that we might talk expansion, especially if we're not going to talk expanding the playoffs. I don't think we should expand the playoffs a full round. Like, you can't have 32 teams make the playoffs. That's just silly. But would you be open to some sort of play-in thing like the NBA has, where if you're going to have 34 teams, shouldn't more than half at least be in the conversation, if for no other reason than to make the regular season worth talking about?
You know, I love this topic because I do have opinions on all of this that I rarely discuss, because I mean, I might with my friends,
sure,
but I don't as a professional. So I grew up in the 4 out of 6 made the playoffs. Okay. That was when I was a little kid. And then they changed it to 12 teams, and 8 out of 12 made it. So again, it was 2/3. And as they grew the league, and they expanded again with Buffalo and Vancouver, and then they brought in Kansas City and Washington, and then they brought in and then the WHA came in. It seemed like they kept that 2/3 type thing. There were 16, I think, out of 21 at one point. And everybody, of course, at that point that were non-old hockey people were complaining that everybody makes the playoffs. Only 5 teams don't. So then they started to expand, and now we've gone from 21 and added 11 more teams, but still only have 16 teams making it. So now you have 50% of the league is got their fan base mad at them at the end of the year.
Right.
And 50% of the fan bases are okay with their team. You know, they're good with their team at the end of the year. And it's really hard on managers and coaches because, you know, you get injuries. Well, you know, as well as I do, you get injuries and you get crap happens, and, you know, you end up just out of it. And it's really hard to get over that threshold. Even this year, I could tell you for sure just after Thanksgiving, and I'll bet you I was only going to be wrong by 2 teams, who was going to be in the playoffs and who was not going to be in the playoffs, because it's so hard to jump up over teams when you've got this kind of a league. And the 3-point games are really make it difficult to jump. St. Louis Blues, of course, blew everybody up in the Western Conference with that 12-game winning streak. But had it not been for that, and I go on Utah radio every week, and I said, had it not been for that, the hockey club and Vancouver and Calgary were all in play to make it. But St. Louis just blew everybody away with their winning streak. And that's what it takes. If you remember last year, Washington did that in the East, and Philadelphia had a plummet near the end and they fell out of it. Getting back to your question is, I would just like to see it where a few more teams made the playoffs, like not half and half. I'd like to see it at least be 60-40. Or something, so that there weren't as many upset fans. I mean, we know the fans are pretty good. Well, especially in LA when you win every home game. But
yes, that's helped. Yeah.
But they're really good if their team makes the playoffs, even if they lose in the first round, they're pretty excited. They got into the playoffs. So that's my thought. Now, how they do that if they expand, I don't know. I never dreamed, Jesse, that there would be 32 teams. Never in my life did I dream that.
I mean, I was a teenager when there were 21 teams, like you mentioned earlier, and I never thought there'd be 32 teams. When we hit 30, I thought, okay, this is it. This is it for the rest of, for the next few decades. And then Vegas and Seattle, and now I'm hearing rumblings about all sorts of markets that don't make
Houston,
any sense to me.
I hear Houston, Atlanta.
I heard New Orleans in one conversation, which makes no sense to me, but neither did Vegas. So, and I'm sure, my dad always reminds me that LA made no sense to him, in 1966. So here we are.
So, and the original owner of the Kings, as you know, was Jack Kent Cooke, who owned the tower in New York, which name is escaping me, and it shouldn't.
Yeah, I should know that.
Chrysler Building.
Yes.
He owned the Chrysler Building. And his quote was, getting a franchise in the National Hockey League is a license to print money. You can look that up. He said that. Then I think when he saw the Forum half empty, he probably wanted to take that back.
Well, the quote that I always hear attributed to him is, which is where I thought you were going with this, so one of the reasons to put a team in LA at the time was that I think LA has the second highest number of Canadians living in one city outside of Toronto.
Wow.
because it's just such a big city. But of course, the attendance was not to Jack Kent Cooke's taste. And so he said he never realized that the reason they lived in California is because they hate hockey. The reason they moved from Canada.
That's a good one.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
I don't know if he ever actually said it, but it's attributed to him. So let's move away from the standings thing, because I could get into tanking and how having half the league not make the playoffs increases. Anyway, it's a whole conversation for another day. But you were the general manager of the New York Rangers in 1994, which is I hesitate to use the word legendary, but it's a very famous cup winning team. How much of that is because of Marc Messier and the Game 7 guarantee? How much of that is because it's in New York, and anything that happens in New York obviously gets an extra level of attention paid to it? How much of it was Brian Leach, Mike Richter? I mean, that was an incredible team.
Yeah, I think there's a number of factors that go into it. I think, first of all, because New York in hockey hasn't won a Stanley Cup since 1940, and that curse to be broken that year, I think that hockey was on the way up at the time and basketball was stagnant. The NBA was a bit stagnant. So I think everybody was getting really excited about that. I think that that we had a star on Broadway in Mark, undoubtedly, with Mess. And of course, you guys had Wayne, and that was so exciting when we got to play the Kings. But I think it was the things you say and the way the playoffs went that year. I mean, we swept the Islanders. We got rid of Washington in 5. We had our hands full with New Jersey and went to double overtime in Game 7, and the great guarantee game in Game 6 by Mess.
Sorry, Game 6. Not saying so.
Yeah, and then the Vancouver series. You know, we were up 3-1, and everybody thinks, "Oh, you're going to win in Game 5." Well, we lose Game 5, and then we lose Game 6, and then it comes back to the Garden, and it's a 3-2 win at the Garden. So, as I was talking to Sam Rosen the other day on my podcast, I was saying, like he said, what could be better for a broadcaster than to be able to call the team's championship that you followed your whole life in Madison Square Garden, in Manhattan? And he said it's just such a big thing. And then he has that famous line, "This one will last a lifetime," and truly has been lasting a lifetime for all of us.
So the topics that I was sort of prepped on that you would be, ideally situated to talk about, one of them was the most memorable and controversial trades in NHL history. Now, the reason I'm bringing up trades is because the Kings just acquired Andrei Kuzmenko from the Flyers at the trade deadline.
Yeah.
And when they acquired him, and I've said this many times, so apologies to listeners who've heard this before, I had almost forgotten, Neil, that he was in the league. He had that dynamite debut with Vancouver a few years ago, and then the next season he was traded to Calgary. It didn't go nearly as well. Then I didn't know he was traded to Philadelphia, frankly, until we acquired him for a 3rd-round pick. And so when he was acquired, I sort of thought, okay, well, fine. He's a right shot forward. We don't have many of those. We'll see how it goes. I read all the scouting reports. I read what everybody had to say about him. I knew that he had that one incredible season in Vancouver, but I just didn't know anything about him, didn't have any expectations. Didn't score a point in his first 7 games, and if I'm not mistaken, he's got 21 in the subsequent 14. He's been an incredible addition. When you're general managing a team, how do you... what's the thought process in adding a player that will change the dynamic, not just of the line that you intend him to play on, but the rest of the lineup? And then do you talk to the coaches? Do you tell them, I'm getting this guy to play this role? Or do you get a guy and then let the coaches decide for themselves?
I think it's almost the reverse. So you're watching the team all season, and I'm going to make this up now because I haven't talked to Rob Blake about it, so I'm going to make it up. But they saying, well, we need a right shot on the power play. Or we could be so much better if we had a skilled guy on the power play, a right-hand shot. And then Rob and his pro scouts are out watching the league all year, and they realize that Kuzmenko is available, probably was available from Calgary, and but they didn't have what Calgary wanted, or they weren't sure whether to take him. And so he goes to the Flyers, which we were really all of us that sort of like watched this side, the eastern side, a lot more than the western side because we live here. We're sort of scratching our heads of why did they give up on those two guys, Philadelphia, that is, and bring in another Russian guy with not a great reputation for Tortorella, when Tortorella's already having problems with the kid that he's got that's the rookie, the sensational rookie. And, you're scratching your head going, is this going to be, are they serious with Torts on this one? Like giving Torts this guy. And he didn't do a heck of a lot in Philadelphia. I don't have the stats in front of me, but he didn't do a heck of a lot.
I think he was only there for like 7 games, though. I mean,
right, exactly, exactly. He was there for a cup of coffee, but I would imagine that Rob and his staff talked to Russian players. They talked to people that know him, and they got enough reconnaissance on him that they knew that if he was put in the right situation, that he could blossom. Winning changes guys. If they get into a winning environment, it is addictive. It rubs off onto you. And when you're around, I'm sure when you're around the guys that the LA Kings have got with Doughty and Kopitar and so on, it rubs off on you, and you don't want to let those guys down, because that's who in the locker room. You don't want to let down your teammates. I'm sure Kuzmenko, finally his skill has come out. And, it reminds me, Jesse, of the of the Washington Capitals, in that they have about 2 or 3 Kuzmenkos in their lineup, meaning that they got guys that didn't work out in other places and suddenly have clicked for the Caps. You had one of them last year with the Kings in Pierre-Luc Dubois. He that was his 3rd try. It wasn't it at fitting in, and he didn't fit in. And I got to be honest with you, when Rob Blake got rid of him quickly after 1 year, I thought, well, wow, I'm surprised Washington will take him. And look at how he's played this year. He's found a niche. And I'm saying the same thing about Kuzmenko. He's finally found the niche, and I'm sure they did their homework to find out that it was possible that he could find a niche.
Couple thoughts on that answer. One, have you heard the Kuzmenko quote about playing with Kopitar yet?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so perfect, because what you said is exactly what happened. He made some comment. Somebody asked him, because he had I think it was against Winnipeg. He had a couple of really strong neutral zone plays that led to goals, where all of us were like, okay, we knew he could shoot, we knew he could pass, but we didn't know that he would, stick lift a guy coming through the neutral zone and go the other way and score a goal. And so the question was, you're back checking, you're getting involved defensively, like, where did this come from? And he basically said, yeah, if I don't, I get a dirty look from Andrei Kopitar, and I don't want that. So you go like, okay, perfect.
Well, I told you that can be intimidating when you're sitting in a room with winners.
And then the other thought about that was, for years, I had a policy as a fan and an observer of the team, never to acquire players from Buffalo or Calgary. And my position was just that those franchises just haven't, at that point in time, I don't remember what year it was like 2013-ish that I had developed that attitude. And my thought process was, those franchises just have not been winning lately, and they don't have a lot of success. And I was scared that if you brought in a player from that environment and added it to your team, you wouldn't be getting much of anything. Then the Kings acquired Robin Regeer, and he was great. And they won the cup in 2014, and he played in the playoffs, and he got injured, but he definitely contributed. And I thought, all right, well, I may have to reassess that position. Now, the other thing that you mentioned was, and I'm going to use this to transition into a conversation about analytics, but you mentioned Russian players. The Kings have Vladislav Gavrikov, who I assume they must have at least spoken to about the potential of acquiring Kuzmenko. And I'm assuming it helps if you are a player from a particular part of the world. I'm assuming it helps to have countrymen who understand your culture and your language and your history. When the Kings acquired Gavrikov, I remember reading a ton of articles in The Athletic and other publications that said, here's this guy, he's been in Columbus, his analytic numbers, quote unquote analytics, don't suggest that he's a strong player in the style that the Kings need. And then the Kings acquired him, and it turned out that everything everybody said about him was wrong. He's been fantastic. He was named today the best defenseman of the LA Kings for the 2024-25 season. You know, he switched to the right side to play alongside Mikey Anderson once Drew Doughty got hurt in the preseason. There were concerns that once Matt Roy left, he would be, you know, exposed, and that, you know, his success in LA was as a result of the partnership. All of that turned out not to be true. He has been nothing but good in LA. So some of that can be environmental and, like you said, finding a niche. But what does that say about the effectiveness of analytics that they can't account for things like fitting in and the niche in the locker room and the culture and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, I've always thought that analytics should be a tool to be used with the hockey people doing what they do, eyes and ears and experience for many, many decades and so on. But add analytics to it, but don't let analytics dictate over the human side of things. And yeah, you would talk to that player in the locker room about Kuzmenko. I'm sure they did that. Because nothing is like talking to somebody who really knows somebody and has played with them and knows what they're like in the trenches. And again, I love to find things that could give you an edge on people, give you an edge on who's going to win tonight. How can I figure out who's going to win tonight between Calgary and LA? I want to, is Kuzmenko going to score a goal because he's going to show Calgary? Like, is that a good bet? Like, and when I say bet, I mean it figuratively.
Yeah.
But I love that stuff. So I do want to get an edge, and I would embrace analytics, but only to a point. I would never let it override what I find out with my eyes and my ears.
You know, it's just such a bizarre thing because so one of my favorite groups of people to talk to at my office with the Kings is the analytics department, because they're obviously thinking about the game in a totally different way than everybody else in the building. And so I get in these arguments with them about the new one is basically face-offs. Do face-offs matter? And their argument is that it's just one of 100 puck battles in the course of a game, and it doesn't matter. And there's no correlation between teams with a strong face-off percentage and winning and everything. But I can see from the look on your face, you have the same reaction I do, which is that's ridiculous. I've watched games where the game-winning goal is scored off of a face-off in the defensive or offensive zone that came as a result of 3 icings in a row. Like it clearly matters. It may just not be the definitive, okay, fine, the team with the best face-off percentage doesn't always win the Stanley Cup, but you can't tell me that they're not important.
Of course not. I mean, first of all, a face-off win in the offensive zone is a scoring chance right away, because it just is. You control the puck. If on the power play, if the defensive team wins the draw back, guess what? You're chasing it all the way back down your end of the ice. And that's just the obvious. But even at center ice, you win the faceoff at center ice, you control the puck. Whenever you win the faceoff, you control the puck. And I get that maybe you can't draw a straight line between faceoff percentage wins and playoffs, non-playoffs, goal scoring. I mean, the New York Islanders, I think this year were number 1 in faceoffs. I think they were very close, if not number 1.
No.
Well, guess what? On power play and penalty kill, they were number 31 and 32.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's no, I find that analytics people and guys that are non-hockey people, in other words, they're not nuts and bolts hockey, they're analytics, and maybe they really love the game and they maybe even been to 1,000 hockey games, but you can't, this is not a game that you can draw these straight lines in. There's only 2 parts of the game that you can even say are set plays, and that's power play and penalty kill. Like, once you drop the puck 5-on-5, you got to have the right instincts to know what to do, because anywhere, and you've got to know how to handle it anywhere on that 200 by 85 sheet of ice.
So that's going to transition us into the Kings and Oilers series, because this is the fourth year in a row the two teams have played. I think a lot of people I've spoken to share my position, which this is the most confident I have been in those four series heading into the series. And I use the word confident very deliberately because I am aware that if the series were played exclusively 5-on-5, I would think that the edge would go to the Kings. But it's not. There will be power plays and penalty kills. And as you said, those are the closest things to set plays. And unfortunately for the Kings and the fans, Edmonton has Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl. And those two guys can improvise and hurt you, especially on special teams, in ways that no other players in the league can, as much as it pains me to admit. If you are, and you have been the general manager of a team and you're trying to build a team that will, succeed 5-on-5 where the majority of the game is played, but also be inoculated against, these incredible power plays that you're going to go up against. And in a 7-game series, the coaching staff on the other side as well. How do you prepare for that heading into a playoff series, and how do you prepare for that in the summer and the months that you have the opportunity to craft your team?
Well, one of the things that I think that you have to do is look at where are your strengths when you get there. Like when you become the GM or as you're going through your years as the GM, identifying where your strengths are and building around those strengths. Like one of the things I want to say, and I mean this, how could I not mean it? The Kings have got 105 points right now. They could get to 107 tonight. It is amazing to me with no real rebuilding, no real tear down, no nothing, 2 Stanley Cups in their pocket albeit from 10 and 11 years ago now, but still, they've been able to keep this as a really competitive team, a team that has gone through coaches, but still stayed competitive and still made the playoffs. And this year, I think the Kings might be the worst team for the Oilers because of how good they are defensively, how they hold you to so few shots, how they defend so well. Their home ice dominance, I don't quite understand it other than I know they're a good team. It's the same sized rink in all the different cities. Why is it that at crypto.com that they're so strong? I don't know. And has it just been one of those years? But they are a very strong team defensively, and I wouldn't want to try to, go loosey goosey on the Kings. If you play a loose game with the Kings, I don't think you can't win. And I don't think the Kings want to play a game where they're going to try to outscore the Oilers. No. That would be silly.
Yeah.
But I do think that the goaltending matches up. And I think that for all the strengths that you just mentioned, I think Draisaitl and McDavid and Bouchard on the power play are amazing. They're not that great 5-on-5 as they've shown over the year. I think they're in for a really tough time this year. I do. I just see the Kings as such a strong systems defensive shutdown team, and that's everybody's bought into it. That I think it's got to be worrisome this year that the Oilers can't just go and out talent them the way they had in the other years.
I'm going to ask what I am concerned might be an odd question, and I'm going to do it through a metaphor, so I apologize in advance. I've been obsessed for a while now, and particularly this year. The question is, what makes a good coach? And the obvious answer is, well, does he win a lot of games? But we had Todd McClellan here, who's won a lot of games and, lost 2 series against the Oilers and then was fired. And then, Jim Hiller came in and they lost last season. But I'm going to use the Death Star in the Star Wars movies for my good coach metaphor, and hopefully this will make sense. And if it doesn't, let me know. In the Star Wars movies, they built the Death Star, and it was supposed to be this unbeatable monstrosity, this huge thing that can blow up planets, and it's the Death Star. It's this big, terrible thing. But then at the end of the day, it was blown up by one pilot flying in and hitting the perfect shot at the perfect time. And it turns out no big deal, right? It's not this big, terrible, unbeatable thing. It's actually pretty simple. It just requires something incredibly difficult to do. So if you build a team like the Kings have had with solid defense and good systems, and, they allow the fewest shots, I think last season they had the second best penalty kill in the league or something like that. But then they go up against, McDavid and Draisaitl, who went 45% on the power play or something like that. So what makes a good coach? Because I'm it's Jim Hiller's first full season as a coach, and he stands in a position heading into the game against Calgary tonight. He could potentially be the coach of the LA Kings team that sets franchise records for wins and points in a season. So it seems absurd to suggest that he's not a good coach. But it's his first full season as an NHL coach in his career. So, what makes a good coach? How do you recognize good coaches coming up? If a good coach can win, Daryl Sutter, for example, could get you to the playoffs, could get you to the finals, but until 2012 hadn't won, and so was he was he not a good coach up until 2012? It seems absurd to suggest that.
Well, a coach is only good as the players that he's got, and the coaches, I think real good coaches can get teams to overachieve. In other words, they can get them to play even better than maybe they have the talent for. And I got to be honest with you, when they fired McClellan last year and Jim Hiller became the coach, and then the Kings they went out in the first round, and then Rob Blake's made Jim Hiller the permanent head coach. And I'm totally honest with you. I'm sitting in Greenville, South Carolina, where I live some of the time. And I'm just going what's Rob doing? Why, what proof does he have that this guy knows what he's doing? Now, I don't say that to anybody. Those were my thoughts, and everyone's allowed their thoughts.
Sure.
Right? So, and I'm so happy for Luke and for Rob that Jim Hiller's done a fantastic job this season. And, we talk about Spencer Carberry, who's probably going to easily win Coach of the Year this year, the Jack Adams Award. I've never spoken to Spencer Carberry. I think he's done a great job only because of the wins and losses. And somebody said last night, as I'm watching the Carolina-Montreal game, that could put Montreal into the playoffs, and it ended up that it did. The great job that Marty St. Louis has done with the Montreal Canadiens. And I'm thinking, has he really? How many years have they missed the playoffs and not been very good? And now this year they're squeaking in on the last day of the season. And I'm not saying he's not a good coach. I'm not saying either way, but how do we know that he's done a great job? By watching TV, and yet what it's got to go back to, Jesse, is what you said. The body of work is there. He's won a lot of hockey games. He's steered the team to win a lot of hockey games. And as much as I'll go back to 1994, and we had a crazy man as a coach in Mike Keenan, who was just a pain in the ass. I mean, just a total pain in the ass. He was, he wouldn't, he didn't see any chain of command. It was just him and his way. And, he was completely insubordinate in his role with me as the GM. But we won, and we won the President's Trophy, and we won the Cup. Did he do a good job? Yes, he did a great job because we won. So however he did it, he did it. And so I guess I'm agreeing with your first point, and that is you've got to go on the body of work, the wins and losses, and then figure out if you can get along with the guy. But if it's a veteran guy, like you talked about Todd McClellan, you got to look at how far can he take the team if you think your team is a team that can get there to begin with. Like if you think your team, like he's in Detroit now, they're not going to win the Cup. But is he a team that Stevie Yzerman thought he could get them playing a lot better than Derek Lalonde? And he did. He got them playing way better than Derek Lalonde did for whatever reason. And they almost made the playoffs. So there's a lot that goes into it about figuring out who the right guy is to bring in for the personnel you've got. it's really hard. And I think that that's one of the reasons. Just the other night, I was out to dinner and somebody said to me, why do they keep going with these retreads all the time? It's the same coaches, because you don't know what you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So you get the guy that from Western Michigan University, where I went, that just won the national championship. I said, well, he must be a good coach. He won the
with
national
a Kings
championship.
prospect in net, by the way.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. And there's no evidence that he knows how to coach men in the National Hockey League. And I'm not, I'm just saying, so it's hard to go outside of the guys that you've seen do it. Those are the only guys that know how to do it.
So then this doesn't necessarily, well, I guess it relates to the Kings. So then if a coach is only as good as the players that he has, and, you can look at a case like the Kings, for example, right? Jim Hiller comes in and he takes over a team that is essentially constructed the way it had been for the past few seasons. But then this summer, Rob Blake goes out, trades Pierre-Luc Dubois for Darcy Kemper, who's been outstanding, acquires Warren Fogle, acquires Joel Edmondson, acquires Tanner Jeannot, tweaks the team, couple additions by subtraction, couple guys that left in free agency, brings in some veterans. I think we had 10 new roster players on the team at the start of the season. And Jim Hiller's getting all the credit for this incredible season. As a former executive yourself, do you ever say, hey, wait a second, I put the coach in a position to succeed. He just did what he was supposed to do with the pieces I gave him. Why isn't anybody pointing at me and talking about what a fantastic job I did? I mean, you built the Rangers team.
Yeah. And you know what, though? You don't need to ever say it, because it's, Rob hired the coach. He went out and signed the free agents. He made the trades. He did all this stuff. And yes, they can all rave about Jim Hiller, but
not that Jim Hiller doesn't deserve it, but
no. They can rave about Jim Hiller, and they should. But you've got to ask at some point, well, who is the smart enough to make Jim Hiller the coach? Well, it was Rob Blake. Well, man, that's a great decision in a situation where you're strictly a decision maker, which is what Rob Blake is. He makes the final decision on things. He's made some damn good decisions. And so he's got to get a lot of credit for that. It never bothered me personally. It never bothered me that anybody got any credit that at all. Like with Mess, Mark Messier gets all the credit for winning the Stanley Cup in New York. Mess led them to the cup. Mess wasn't for, well, I actually agree with you. I think that's true. It was Mess. But at some point you got to say, well, who was it that pulled the trigger on trading for Mess? And, that was me. I did that. So it's like, it never really bothered me. I hoped all our people got tons of credit, because that means then I'd done a good job. If my people are all getting a lot of accolades, then I guess I did a good job.
So then the next question I have, and this is a tough one for me as a fan, as an employee of the team, as an observer of the team, and as someone who tries to discuss the game in a way that means something. And I've been watching this game my entire adult life, most of my whole life. I suspect the same is true of you. Mm-hmm. The thought that somehow it's all just luck and random really bothers me, because it can't be, right? Like, I've spent my entire life believing that my heroes are heroes, and that, the people I admire for a reason. And the thought that it just sort of works out the way it works out, and there's no rhyme or reason to it, really bothers me. But the older I get and the more I start looking at things, the more I wonder, I don't know, coach of the year candidates are fired all the time. Teams, like the Kings, we had a Stanley Cup champion in 2012, an incredibly dominant team. In 2014, it wasn't as dominant, but it was just as impressive, with 3 Game 7 wins on the road. And everybody knows the story. They made the Western Conference Finals in 2013. And then 4 years later, if it's 4 years later, 3 years later, whatever it was, the coach is fired. We're drafting second overall in 2020. And you're just wondering, like, what happened? Like, this team was so good and poised to what I thought was going to be years of contention, and it just kind of morphed into something else. So there's not really a good question in there, but I guess what I'm asking is, how much does luck play, or not luck, but how much does things out of your control? Because that, I mean, ultimately you're one team of 30 or 20 or 32 or 21 or however many teams there are in the league at any given moment in history. There are all sorts of things out of your control. How much does that change the success or failure of any given team? It's a weird question. I'm
well,
sorry.
no, I think it's what you're saying is how much is just coincidence and how much is real intelligence, meaning not the mental intelligence, but intelligence, putting together a lot of information
I'll use the
building.
Kings as an example, because this is one that I get wrapped up in conversation. So the Kings in 2012 and 2014 had Jeff Carter and Mike Richards, two incredible players that were incredibly useful for the Kings during those cup runs. They acquired them because on one day, randomly in the summer of 2011, the Philadelphia Flyers decided that they were going to trade their captain and Jeff Carter in order to make cap space to acquire Ilya Bryzgalov. They decided that what they needed was a goaltender, and it had to be that goaltender, and it was worth trading Richards and Carter. And I'm sure there were other factors that went into that decision. But if Philadelphia doesn't trade those two players that they had signed to incredibly long contracts, they're never available for the Kings to acquire in the first place. And so the idea that Dean Lombardi had built this team with a very specific plan in mind, that okay, well, we'll do this and we'll accomplish that, and then we'll add this player and we'll add that player. It couldn't have happened that way, because there's no way that you could have known that Carter and Richards would be available. And it's not like they got him on the same day. They traded for Mike Richards. Carter was sent to Columbus, and then he had to not work out in Columbus. So it's like a sequence of events of other teams making decisions that Dean Lombardi was able to capitalize on. He was able to improvise and seize those moments as they presented themselves. But then in 2014-15 season, there were injuries, there were illnesses, there were suspensions, there were just things that you can't control for. And then the rest of the league down the stretch in 2014-15, I think the Kings missed the playoffs by just a handful of points that year. And it felt like every time there was a game that would help us out in the standings, it went the wrong way for us. So Calgary went on a little run. And I mean, we called it Operation Regicide as a joke amongst the fans, because it was like every time that we had a chance for the standings to work out, it didn't. And then you go from a Stanley Cup champion to a team that misses the playoffs. And at some level, like I said, the march up to contention involved teams doing things that you had no control over. And the march down to missing the playoffs had a lot to do with teams doing things that you had no control over. And I don't know. That's the part I wrestle with.
Yeah, but I think you've described it perfectly, and that is how the game goes and the league goes. That there are some things that you just don't have control over, and then there are other things that you make decisions when they present themselves. And so, had Edmonton not been trying to get away from signing, they didn't have the money, so they were disposing of players at that particular time. And Mess became available, and Graves, there was that different kind of Group 1 free agent where I could sign him and keep him. And then we got Boom, and they wanted to get younger, cheaper players in Edmonton. And I was ready to absorb all the Edmonton guys because I had to win. Because in New York, if you don't win in 5 minutes, you're out. Yeah. So I think that there's some things you just have no control over, and some things you. So in our situation, because I can describe it to you, so we get all those Oilers and other players, and we're built to win, and we do win. And then I tell everybody, I know you don't want to hear this, but in a few years, we're going to be in trouble because we took everything out of the cupboard to pay for what you just saw on the ice. Well, when 1995 rolls around, in 1996 and 1997, they don't want to hear that.
Yeah.
They don't want to hear about that. They're like, well, no, we don't care. We're buying tickets and going to games this year. We want to know about this year. And eventually then I get fired, at the end of 2000. So it's you have control to seize the moment on what's available at that time, do the hard decisions you've got to make. and then do the best you can when things aren't going your way to minimize the damage. But there's not a lot you can do some years. Some years you can do a lot. Other years you can't do much. You're just stuck. And for example, too, I mean, there are teams that are stuck economically where they just can't do, for example, let's say what LA and New York can do. They can't. You can't do in Nashville, although they spent a ton of money this year, or you can't do in Anaheim, right down the road from you, what they can do in LA, because Anaheim's building's half empty every night. Now, I know the Samuelis are very wealthy and they can deal with stuff, but they're not, they can't do it. Utah's got 21 million in cap space because they come from Arizona where they had no money. So, all of those things are different elements to this business that are, as you said, some are in your control and some are not in your control. But you can always say in any situation that, it just happened that I was working in New York one year in a totally different business when I got a press pass to go to the Nassau Coliseum and go to Islander games. And that led me to come up with the idea of going to Ranger games and giving scouting reports to Al Arbor. And then Al Arbor gave me a full-time job doing it, and then on and on and on. So I seized the moment because I saw a little opening there. But had I not been in New York, I would never be in the NHL. I could come back to that. And so I think you're seeing it the right way, but that's really how it is.
So this question is just for my own personal satisfaction. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the Kings. You were general manager of a National Hockey League team over a decade that saw the average salary grow exponentially. Doesn't even begin to describe it. I mean, I don't know what the average salary was in 1989, but it was probably lower than the minimum salary today.
I can tell you a story about that, but go ahead.
So, I mean, I just, I didn't realize it at the time because I was in high school and graduated and in college when all of this was going on. But when I go back and I look at it and I think about the contract that I think Lemieux was the first one, and then McNall matched it and gave Gretzky a big contract, and then the Penguins had to give Lemieux a big contract. And before I knew it, we're looking at guys with career earnings of, $100 million. And I mean, I think this is no disrespect to Rob Blake at all, but I think Rob Blake is still in the top 10 in career earnings in the National Hockey League, or at least he was recently. And it was over $90 million. And it was like, okay, Rob Blake was good, but come on, but he happened to be playing at the time of this, salaries expanding. Were you as a general manager just like opening the newspaper every day and screaming at the other teams for handing out these huge contracts because it meant you had to then do it?
Well, yes and no. I think most people were screaming at me because of, New York has the money, and New York's always got to do what they got to do, or else the New York fans are all screaming at you and the newspapers are writing bad stuff about you and that. But I'll give you an example of where we were in 1989 when I got the job. So we went to training camp in 1989. Our highest paid player was Marcel Dion, $500,000. And Roger Nielsen didn't think that Marcel could fit into the plan that he had for the team. And I ended up having to buy him out. And that was the end of his career, Marcel Dion's career. But the second year, that was 89, 90, 90, 91. Ron Greschner had been with the Rangers for, you could look it up, I don't know, 12 years or more, maybe. And we didn't re-sign him because he made $365. And it was too much. Mm-hmm. So that's where we were back then. The McNall signing of Wayne with fraudulently earned money exploded the salaries in the NHL. And then the salary disclosure that came in the negotiations exploded the salaries. But I remember having to negotiate Mark's contract, and one of the comps that they were using was Gretzky in LA. And we're saying at that time, or maybe it was on the second contract that Mark got with us. It might have been the second contract because it was later in the 90s. We're saying, yeah, but he got signed with ill-begotten money. Like,
Right.
I mean, it wasn't even his
Right.
money.
Yeah.
You know, and so how can you hold that against us? And so anyway, he ended up getting what he wanted anyway. But yeah, the salary structure went nuts. The league was always mad at us because of the salaries we were giving out. But sometimes there's nothing you could do. For example, with Brian Leach, who was a Conn Smythe Trophy winner and the two-time Norris Trophy winner and one of the best American players ever to live. They wouldn't let me sign him the year ahead of when he was going to become a free agent. They just said, no, we're not doing this is the guys who know nothing that own the team, right? And so then it came to the next summer, and Leachy wanted to stay, and I wanted him to stay, but we were stuck. We had to give him whatever he wanted because, you know, he could walk out the door on us. And so, you know, my point is that goes to what you said. Some things you can control and some things you can't. If they tell you as the owners, you're not paying this guy more than X, it doesn't matter. It's not your money. You can't do anything about that. And if they say, well, use your judgment, well, that's where you jump in and use your judgment.
Last question, and this one we're going to cycle back to Kuzmenko. They acquire him at the trade deadline. He's obviously performed incredibly well, but he's never played an NHL playoff game before. The playoffs are set to begin. There are a number of players in NHL history, Claude Lemieux, Chris. I said Chris Simon the other day in an episode, but I don't think he might not have been who I was thinking of. But guys who outperformed their expectations in the playoffs, right? Like Claude Lemieux, regular season, he was a fine player, but playoffs, it was like, oh my God, who is this guy? How do you know, or are there signs that you can look for in a player to identify them as a playoff star?
You can only do it based on performance because you don't know until they're put there. Jeff Skinner has not played a playoff game yet in his career, and I think he's been in the league for 14 years or something. And now he'll get his first playoff game with the Edmonton Oilers this year. How will he play? You know, who knows? You're the same with Kuzmenko. I can tell you, though, that when I was GM and I was looking at potential players as free agents or for trades, it did matter to me whether or not they had playoff experience because I was thinking, do they know how to win? Do they know how to do it? Okay. I'll go back to what I said at the beginning of this show. You get in that locker room with Kopitar and Doughty, and I don't know, but I get the feeling that Kempe is like this, even though he hasn't been around a long time, but just by watching him play, you don't want to let those guys down. And you're going to do whatever you're told is your role on that team. And it rubs off on you. You know, if when you're on a team that's got Stanley Cup winners in the room, you do what you got to do.
Well, listen, Neil, this has been a ton of fun. I could waste your entire day, but I know you've got a couple labs that need their exercise, and I don't want to take your entire day. But thank you so much for joining me. Like I said, this was a ton of fun, and you know, listen, I work with a couple guys from New York, and I'm still hearing about that team in '94. So,
yeah, well, Jesse, thanks for having me on, and God bless you, and you'll be in my thoughts and prayers.
I appreciate it. And if people want to listen to the Wraparound podcast, where do they go to do that?
Oh, anywhere. NHL Wraparound is, on all the different podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, all over the place. And hopefully we bring a little bit different angle on things and come out with things that people maybe didn't know in the past. I've got a great co-host in Vic Morin, and we have great guests. I mean, we've got, we just did a show with Sam Rosen the other day that was fantastic. It was a lot of fun. We've had Paul Maurice on the trading deadline. Paul Maurice came on. I couldn't believe Paul would do it. And we've had some real good guys. Craig Button is coming on from Canada for our playoff preview show. So we have great guests, and hopefully we bring some things to the table that aren't being brought in other places, and people want to listen.
Well, Craig Button once said one thing that was slightly unfavorable about the Kings. I don't even remember what it was anymore, but I've held it against him ever since. So
you do that. When you're a fan, you do that.
Yeah. We won't hold it against you, though, Neil. Thank you again for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jesse.